Our esteemed speaker, Aidan Dodson, is a world-renowned Egyptologist and historian. He has been honorary professor of Egyptology at the University of Bristol since 2018. Born in London, he completed a BA at the University of Liverpool in 1985 and an MPhil in '86, Museum Practice and Archaeology, and a PhD in '95, Egyptology at Christ's College, Cambridge. He began teaching at the University of Bristol in October of '96, also holding the post of Simpson Professor of Egyptology at the American University in Cairo from January to July 2013. His primary research interests concern ancient Egypt, with a particular focus on dynastic history and chronology, tomb architecture, sarcophagus and coffin design, canopic equipment, and the history of Egyptology. She is also an historian of late 19th century and early 20th century navies, and has written on the royal tombs of Great Britain. He's an author of over 30 books, 400 articles and reviews, and is well known to viewers of documentaries concerning Egyptology. He was elected a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of London in 2003, and I cannot begin to describe how happy I am to welcome our guest tonight, Aidan Dodson.
Thank you very much indeed, Anthony. Lovely to be back here in New York again and talk about a group of pharaohs who are probably amongst the least known to the general Egyptological audience, and also in many ways actually to Egyptologists themselves. They are one of the two groups of pharaohs during the first millennium BC who came from very much out of the left field, in the sense that they and the succeeding Nubian pharaohs of the 25th dynasty came from peoples who'd been historically enemies of Egypt. And by some means, which is still not 100% clear, during a number of centuries, the pharaohs of Egypt and a number of the senior officials and priests came from these previously reviled groups. When we talk about Libya, as far as the origins of these people who became pharaohs of Egypt is concerned, we're talking about Cyrenaica, this area, this coastal part, which later became an important part of the Ptolemaic and Roman empires. We know relatively little about the archaeology of Libya and Cyrenaica, at least in the period leading in years prior to the Ptolemaic times. What we do know, there's some archaeological material, but primarily it's what the Egyptians themselves say about it. And they describe the Libyans as being amongst groups who are enemies of Egypt, and they feature in a number of texts with pharaohs fighting either actions against them as these presented as defensive actions, or actually defending Egypt against invasion. The Libyans form one of the stereotyped peoples, foreign peoples, and a very good representation of them is here in the tomb setting the first in the Valley of the Kings, where in the Book of Gates there are a set of representations of, as we can see here, Syrians, Nubians and Libyans. The Libyans distinguished by their feathers and their general dress. So these are the stereotyped individuals, and there are certain aspects of the iconography here, particularly the feathers in the hair, that form part of recognisable iconography during the Libyan period in Egypt itself. As I say, we have a number of records of conflict between Egypt and Libyans. Here on the left, we've got one of the earliest, a representation of a campaign against the Libyans by Pepi II of the 6th dynasty. And on the right, part of the long set of representations, inscriptions by Murremptah, talking about repulsing a major invasion during his reign. And also Ramesses III in his temple at Medinet Habu also has a representation of campaign against the Libyans. Now, the appearance of the Libyans, other than as foes of Egypt, comes for the first time at the beginning of the 21st dynasty. So it is immediately after the end of the New Kingdom, when Egypt is being thrown up in the air, partly as a reaction to the late Bronze Age collapse which had happened during the early 20th dynasty. Egypt loses control of Nubia. The Ramesside royal dynasty comes to an end, and in Thebes the kingship is taken by a man called Herihor, who may be a relative of the previous line of High Priest of Amun, but his ancestry remains something of a matter for debate. And here he is on his wife's Book of the Dead papyrus in the British Museum. Now, in the temple at Khonsu, we find a series of a representation of the children of Herihor. In fact, it's a very, very long set of individuals. Although he is only known to have one wife, Nejmet, it seems physically highly unlikely that all of these children are hers, but she is the only wife that we have referred to. But what's suggestive about at least one of his other wives, who remains anonymous to history, is the fact that some of these princes have Libyan names. The rest of them are all, and princes and princesses all have, whether the names are preserved anyway, have quite standard Egyptian names, but there are these 5 who have Libyan names. This is the first time we find Libyan names appearing amongst Egyptian ruling classes. We can only assume this is because their mother was Libyan. I can't think of any other reason why, but this is one of these typical cases in Egyptology where we've simply got the information that we have a certain situation, but then beyond that, not. We saw that there's finally another one there. And a couple of generations later, the high priesthood of Ammon is held by a man called Masahata. Again, why he's got a Libyan name is unclear, because his father is Pinagem, good Egyptian name. His mother is a Hentawi, another good Egyptian name. So quite why he has got a Libyan name, and his brothers and sisters all have perfect Egyptian names, is another of these mysteries. All one can say is that a Libyan strand of some description is moving itself into the Egyptian ruling class. At this time, Egypt, as I say, with the end of the New Kingdom, has changed its centre of gravity, and the city of Tanis in the northeast delta is now the residence of the 21st Dynasty Kingdom. But as we'll see over the coming centuries, Egypt will cease to be, or on a number of occasions will cease to be a unitary state, and indeed at the beginning of the 21st dynasty it is split between Thebes and Tanis, although it comes back together again a little while into that dynasty. And it's the 21st dynasty, these kings who are ruling from Tanis, that we find the first Libyan named king. And this is Azorkon the Elder. His very existence really was only recognised in relatively recent times. A name which seemed to be Azorkon, a typical Libyan name, turns up in the king lists of Manetho, which I'll talk about later on, but there for a long time there was no evidence in actual material of his existence, or at least existing material wasn't recognised as referring to him. But then the inscription at the top, which is an autobiographical inscription of a couple of centuries later, is of an individual who traces part of his ancestry back to the family of Azorkon the Elder. And then on the basis of that, the text at the bottom there, the block on the left, and also the texts on the right, which come from the so-called Karnak priestly annals, which are a set of texts which record priestly appointments over a number of centuries, recognising that these actually belong to this Azorkon the Elder. The reason why we're calling him Azorkon the Elder rather than Azorkon the First is simply because we already, before he was discovered, we already numbered the Azorkons, and then trying to renumber them retrospectively all got very, very ugly. A couple of colleagues did try it, but then it became totally impossible to tell when somebody was writing about whether Azorkon the First was this gentleman. So I think we've generally agreed that. We've got a similar problem at the beginning of the New Kingdom now. A new king Ahmose was discovered a few years ago, and some people have tried to renumber the current Ahmose the First as Ahmose the Second. Myself and hopefully the sensible Egyptologists will call him Ahmose the Elder in the same kind of manner. So anyway, we have this individual, and basically this is another later autobiographical text of a man called Passanhor. And one of the things which we find during the Libyan time of Libyan control of Egypt is a real great emphasis on one's ancestry. And one of the things which we find is a number of these cases, like the text I just showed you, and this one, this stele here, the individual, who, though he's a commoner, has royal ancestry, and he follows all that back through time. And he is a descendant of a brother of Azorkon the Elder, and from that we can tell that Azorkon the Elder is a descendant of a number of generations of Libyans, of Libyan chieftains. So for the first time we know why he's got a Libyan name, because he actually is genuinely of Libyan ancestry. Whether these are people who've lived in Egypt for a number of generations and are still maintaining their Libyan identity, or whether they're recent immigrants, we just simply don't know. But from this particular text, and what the thing on the right would have done, would have shown you actually this bit of the family tree, that's where we know that. So a combination of that previous text at the top and this allows us to tie in Azorkon the Elder, and also then the later kings of what we then have this as the 22nd dynasty, who are what we might call the mainstream Libyan kings. As far as trying to work out who is who on the successions, the Passanhor stele is really, really important, because it actually gives us the marriages and parentages for the first few generations of Libyan pharaohs. But after that, we don't really have anything standalone which we can simply say, here's the list. Because the various famous king lists have all long since fizzled out by now, apart from the much later, and as we'll see, quite corrupt one of Manetho. So the monumental ones like the Abydos king list and so on, which are also useful for earlier Egyptian history, just don't go this far, this late. So what have we got to try and put together? So we've got these genealogical texts, which are very, very handy, because people were very keen to show that they had royal blood, even if it was a long way back, so they give that part of their genealogy. But also we've got here at Karnak, on the what was the waterfront. People who've been to Karnak will recognise this is where you go in. But what we can actually see here, it was the waterfront in the 22nd dynasty. The waterfront now is about 500 yards further to the west, but, and that's one part of the evolution of Karnak, is the way that the river has gradually retreated westwards over the millennia. But here this was actually the waterfront, and as a result, this was where the highest levels of the annual inundation were marked. And these are very handy. Not only do they tell us where the water was, but they name who was king and who was high priest at the same time. So actually, this combination allows us often to be able to further reinforce the information which is provided by these genealogies, to be able to work out who is ruling when, and quite important, as we'll see later on, who is high priest and who might actually be a rival ruler at the same time. So a very, very useful set of data. Also, of course, it gives us some really important environmental data about how high or low the river was in a given year. Now, I mentioned Manetho, the 3rd century BC historian writing in Greek. He says that the royal family came from Bubastis in the northeast delta. And actually, as a result, they've often been called the Bubastite dynasty as well as the Libyan dynasty. We don't really know where he got that from. Certainly, there is building work by the Libyan pharaohs in Bubastis, but whether that really is their city of origin remains completely unknown. There's a certain amount of building work carried out by them. After the end of the New Kingdom, there's really a dearth of monumental building, but the 22nd dynasty, which is kicking off in the middle of the 10th century BC, Zorkon the Elder is a couple of generations earlier, with a couple more Egyptian-named kings following him of unknown origins. But then we pick up the 22nd dynasty. At the beginning of it, there's some quite significant work carried out. Here, the forecourt of the great Karnak temple is all built by Shoshenq the first of the 22nd dynasty. Although the work was never finished. He died prematurely, and subsequently very little work is done here at all. There are odd bits and pieces. So certainly the 22nd dynasty, which is the key Libyan dynasty, certainly doesn't have the kind of monumental structures that earlier times had. So the building work at Karnak, some of it actually bears the name of Shoshenq I, but also rather interestingly we have a stela here at Jebel Silsila, the sandstone quarries halfway between Thebes and Aswan, which actually records the ordering of the quarrying of sandstone for the final phase of Shoshenq's work. So that ties in all that quite nicely. As I say, most of this extension of the Karnak temple was not decorated. The king died before it was complete. But there is one tableau which was completed, and it's this one, which is a smiting scene commemorating a campaign by Shoshenq into Palestine. And this is the first military campaign of any scale recorded since the time of Ramesses III. There is a little bit of evidence that Ramesses VI did some stuff in Syria, Palestine, but not subsequent. So you've got a big gap from the mid 11th century, so mid 12th century, and then the middle of the 10th century, when we seem to have no military activity by the Egyptians into Syria, Palestine. This has been tied in to the Old Testament as well, because the Old Testament actually names a king called Shishak, whose name is quite clearly Shoshenq, the only difference being there's no N, and even there are some writings in Egyptian who miss out the N. And this tableau of a king carrying out a campaign into Syria, Palestine has been tied in very closely by many historians with this passage from the Old Testament. It's the first time the Old Testament actually names a pharaoh of Egypt. Previously, it just talks about Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Now, it actually names names, which is quite useful. The only problem with this is that the campaign recorded in that particular tableau does not include Jerusalem, which is a bit of a problem. And some people, as I'll talk about at the very, very end of the lecture, have tried to deny that Shoshenq is Shoshenq. However, it's worth noting that there are acres upon acres of uninscribed wall of Shoshenq's structures at Karnak. And I think what's most likely is that the campaign which he's actually had a chance to carve before his death is an earlier one, and the Jerusalem campaign came later, not long before his death. So it looks likely there are two campaigns involved here. As far as commemorating that, it's not only by building this work at Karnak, also at El Hiba, which is a site just south of the Fayum. So it's in many ways the dividing line between the Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. It was also administratively an important dividing point. Those are the mounds of Ebheba, viewed from the river, and at the bottom are the remains of a temple built by Shoshenq I there. And amongst the decoration of this is this wonderful smiting scene, now in the museum at Heidelberg University. So very much Shoshenq is doing all the stuff to almost imitate the great pharaohs of the New Kingdom, and also in the same way of using this kind of depictions for that. In addition, we find more evidence that Shoshenq is involved in the Levant, in peacefully as well as militarily, and also recent work in Syria, in southern Palestine, has found Egyptian material of the right sort of date, which suggests it wasn't simply a raid, but there was a period of occupation or some kind of much more sort of intensive relationship during Shoshenq's reign. This is somewhere probably more research is to be done. But one thing which we do have, if I'm showing that, is this in this Jerusalem fragment of stela of Shoshenq I from Megiddo, which again, the very fact he's erected a stela there suggests a slightly longer form of occupation than simply a raid. And then up in Byblos, on the Lebanese coast, Byblos being an important place where pine and cedar was exported around the Eastern Mediterranean, particularly to Egypt. We had no evidence of connections between Egypt and Byblos since the end of the New Kingdom, but now we've got this statue, this is a fragment of a statue of Shoshenq, which was found there, with some Phoenician text as well by the local king. So what we seem to see is that the Shoshenq, the first of the great Libyan kings, if you like, is very much trying to emulate the kings of the New Kingdom, both by military activity into the Levant, but also clearly reinstating trading and other links. The same goes for his successor, Azorkon I, another statue with some Phoenician writing on it. But so initially it seems that Azorkon carries on the tradition which has been restarted by his father, although there's no evidence for Azorkon actually undertaking military activity. All we have is this statue which suggests probably more peaceful trading links. During Azorkon I's reign, his eldest son is appointed High Priest of Amun. One of the things which Shoshenq and Azorkon do is ends the principle of hereditary occupation of the High Priest of Amun at Karnak. Instead, for the next few generations, the High Priest is the son of the currently ruling pharaoh. And Shoshenq Q, the son of Azorkon I, is really interesting because he is one of the very few non-kings or non-queens to use a cartouche. So I think he's clearly setting himself up that he is the crown prince. He was going to become a pharaoh. He therefore uses a cartouche before his father's dead, and probably is punished for that hubris because he dies before becoming pharaoh. But he is very, very high profile, and these are just some of the statues produced for him. The one on the left there is Harpy, the incarnation of the inundation, with the prince's name on figure on the back, and then there are two statues of him as well there, all found at Karnak. Now, after Azorkon I and the death of the heir to the throne, we come across a period which is somewhat problematic. We know that Azorkon was directly had a son, Takelot the First. This is from the genealogical text of Basin-Hor. But very, very little from his reign actually bears his name. And in fact, there are various documents which clearly dated to Takelot the First's reign, but his name isn't mentioned. It's simply used as a dating era, because normally an Egyptian dateline is year so-and-so under the majesty of King so-and-so. That never happens under Takelot. So it suggests that Takelot is some kind of mere cipher. And also in this period we've got a king who we can't really place. It's this, the owner of this rather splendid coffin, Shoshenq 2a. The very fact his ordinal has a sub-letter indicates something of the confusion. There is a potential Shoshenq 2a, b and c as well, but possibly b and c may be spelling mistakes. So it's a problem, but we know that the form of his name means he has to have lived in the period following Azorkon I's death, under Takelot the First. So whether he's some kind of sub-king or what, we simply have no idea. All we can tell is that it's a period possibly of troubles, and troubles are going to sort of be a major feature of the history of the Libyan kings. This is Azorkon I from a stela in the Met, and we'll have a number of stelae in which various bits of land are donated to various gods, and we see a lot of these during the 22nd dynasty, which seems to reflect that a lot of sort of central power is gradually being decentralised, and although the first of the Libyan kings are very clearly trying to rule in the mode of New Kingdom kings, and so bringing power back into the centre by no longer having a hereditary high priest of Amun and stuff like that. We have that changes, and these donation stelae are part of that gradual removal of economic and ultimately political power from the royal centre. And this is one of the very few representations of Takelot I. Not a particularly beautiful piece of work, but I'm showing it because it's about the only representation outside his burial chamber that we actually find Takelot I. So he seems to be some kind of cipher. Very difficult to know really what's going on here at all. And so you've got potentially these three Shoshenqs floating around here, and we can't really quite get a grip on them. Takelot I's son, Azorkon II, is a bit more of a viable entity, and he has a long reign, including celebrating a Hebsed Jubilee, and this is a reconstruction of the gateway at Bubastis, which he erected to mark his Jubilee. And many blocks from this are in museums around the world. It was collapsed in antiquity, but many of the blocks were then excavated by the Beach Preparation Fund in the late 19th century, and many museums have some of them, as well as there being a whole load of them still in place at Bubastis. However, although he's by standards of this period, he's quite a builder, Azorkon seems to have been something of a worried man. And we can tell that from this statue here. Now, the head is in Philadelphia, and the rest of it is in Cairo. It got broken up in antiquity, and the head got picked up in the 19th century and made its way to the US. The rest of it was actually excavated a bit later on. And this is put together by the magic of computer graphics. Luckily I managed to photograph the head and the body at the same angle and managed to merge the two together. In Cairo there is actually a plaster cast of the head displayed alongside the statue. But the main point about this is the text of the statue, in which basically Azorkon is saying that he wants pretty well all the big jobs in Egypt to be in the hands of his children. and then sort of seems to be worried that they might start fighting each other. And the whole thing is sort of a mixture. It's a sort of prayer to Ammon that everything will go well, but the very things he's asking to go well are things no earlier king would sort of think of doing so. That the fact his sons might fight amongst themselves for power and things like that. So it's a very, very odd sort of text. And those worries seem to then herald what happens subsequently when Egypt does indeed start falling apart. So Azorkon, for the time being, is the last king of a truly unified Egypt for some generations. Now, the rot, shall we say, starts in the south. Always in Egyptian history there is this tendency of this north and south to drift apart. And this is what starts to happen here. And this happens a little bit before the end of Azorkon II's reign. Can't place it exactly, but it's certainly probably sometime in the last decade, when there appears at Thebes a separate king, a king called Harziezi. And here he is to be seen on a stela on the left there, and also on a door jamb at Karnak. Unfortunately, much of him is missing. There's just top of his crown and bits of his lower body. But it does show that he is doing some vaguely monumental stuff at Karnak. On this stela, he's shown with the god's wife of Amun. This is the female counterpoint to the high priest of Amun, who, since Ramesside times, had always been a senior royal princess. Very oddly, though, she is probably a daughter of Azorkon II, but never actually tells us that. So it's again suggesting there's some kind of one of this kind of fissure in the royal family, and so suddenly this king Harziezi suddenly appears on the scene. We're not sure about his origins. It used to be thought that he was a high priest who then promoted himself to local king. That no longer seems to be the case, but it does seem that his father was a high priest. Again, mechanisms are not quite clear here, but there is a period of time when Thebes, and certainly a certain amount of southern Egypt, we don't know how much of southern Egypt, is under the control of a separate king. Yeah, so this is Karamama, and she is probably the daughter of Azorkon II, but she never claims to be, and she's the owner of this very famous bronze statue in the Louvre. So although we're talking about a period where things are not going well, starting Egypt starting to fall apart, you're still getting some really, really high quality artistic material produced, including this wonderful statuette of Karamama. Harziezi's cause of death is unclear, but this is his skull, and note he's got a hole in his head. But this is actually a healed hole in his head. He's been trepanned. This is evidence for early head surgery. But quite what happened, whether he had some kind of head injury, which had to be, a bit of bone had to be removed or whatever, it's a fascinating sort of sidelight on the end of his reign. Whether or not this meant that he was subsequently unable to function properly, we have no idea what nature of the injury and whether it was a brain injury with it or not. But it's just interesting that he then just sort of fizzles out. He doesn't have an immediate royal successor at Thebes, which suggests he may perhaps become ill and then sort of retired from view. So for a brief period, perhaps some unity of Egypt is restored, but we can't really be sure. Then it all starts going really horribly wrong. And this is a graphical representation of what's happening at Thebes and at Tanis. Tanis, we carry on the solid line. This is the line which goes back to Azorkon the Elder. So this is the northern, very solid line. But as you can see, Thebes, first of all, we get Harziezi appearing there. And then, after a bit of a gap, just before the end of Azorkon II's reign, a couple of years before the end of his reign, we find a King Teiklot II coming along. And then a few years later, he then has a rival king, Pedobast I, to deal with. And what's going on here can be traced partly by those Nile level texts I was talking about, and also a text I'll be introducing you to in a moment called the Chronicle of Prince Azorkon. And that indicates the way that the high priesthood is shifting between Teiklot's son, Azorkon B, and a high priest, Harziesi. And it almost seems, in some cases, almost an annual or even a swapping over of control. So there's a long simmering, probably a long boiling civil war seems to be going on in the south of Egypt between Azorkon and Harziesi, with Azorkon fighting in the name of his father Teiklot II, and Harziesi fighting in the name of this Pedobast I, who may possibly be a son of Harziesi. Unfortunately, as you can see on the high priest list, there is a king, a high priest, Pedobast, who has more restoration than actual name. Unfortunately, his one text is damaged and only the middle bit survives. But it's restorable, potentially, as Pedobast, and that would make some sense if you've got this person who is a son of the previous local king. But anyway, so we have all this sort of fighting going on over a long period of time. This is one of the few memorials of Teiklot II. So this was found at Elephantini at Aswan, and so therefore seems to indicate that his rule was indeed the whole of southern Egypt rather than just the Theban area. And it's quite possible that during these various times where we know who's in charge at Thebes, and when it's not him, he may still have been ruling a bit further south. Again, we don't have the detail to be able to be sure of that. Most of the data about what's going on during this period is derived from two things. I already said there is the Nile level text, shows who actually is king, in what year, and who is the high priest. But also in the so-called Bubastite portal, which is the one bit of Shoshenq I's building work at Karnak, which was completed and decorated. Part of the interior then has a later text added on by Prince Azorkon, which gives his side of the story. And this indicates when he is in Thebes and making offerings to the god. And there are gaps in that which neatly coincide with the Nile level text telling us that Harziesi is the high priest in charge, with Pedobast I as the king. So combining these two allows us to produce the diagram I showed earlier on. And these are the texts showing how they are in the portal, and they're carved in two phases. So from them we can reconstruct what's going on during this long-running Theban civil war. So working the two together, we get a remarkably clear picture of the comings and goings of who's in charge at Thebes. And at the end, very long end, it's Prince Azorkon who wins. And he becomes King Azorkon III eventually. Although he's probably in his 60s by then, at least, if not older. But he then, as a remarkably sort of resilient individual, he then lives for another 20 odd years. So he's probably 80 or even 90 by the time he dies. It all depends on how young he was when he was appointed high priest. He could have been appointed high priest in his teens, or it could have been later on. So that all influences our calculations on exactly how old Azorkon actually was. Meanwhile, back in Tarnis, the old line is chugging along quite happily, although it does seem that the northern kings may also started to come under pressure from rivals. Shoshenq III, who is the contemporary in Tarnis for most of the Civil War period, builds this gateway, rather fine, a granite one. Although when one looks at the material, one realises that all the material is second-hand. And he's built this granite gateway out of the cut-up remains of a colossus of Ramesses II. Mm-hmm. There's an awful lot of recycling going on here. The Libyan pharaohs were very green in our modern terminology because pretty well everything they touched seemed to have been reused from somebody earlier on, particularly up in the Delta. It's a long, long way to get granite from Aswan, particularly if there's a civil war going on in Thebes. So basically, they are cutting up the material from the old Ramesside capital, Pyramisi, which is only a few miles away from Tarnis, and the gateway here of Shoshenq III is one of those. Meanwhile, in the north, also the burial of the Apis bull is continuing as it had done for generations. And the stelae here are actually quite useful from the point of view of looking at what's going on, because when a bull died, at least this period, we haven't got this from the earlier on periods, is it gives both the age of the bull at death and also the date on which it was born and died. So it gives us an exact interval between a given year of King X and King Y. So it does actually allow, in a period where a lot of the exact chronology is a bit flaky, we can actually have got a couple of really good hooks to be able to do that. And certainly Shoshenq the third and his second successor Pime are neatly linked by stelae like this. Now, but say the power of the kings at Tarnis is being eroded, and we're starting to find in the Delta more of these donation stelae I was talking about earlier on, but also these donation stelae are naming, or sometimes entirely in the name, of a local chieftain of a Libyan tribe. So it's interesting, at the beginning of the Libyan period, then everybody appears to be playing the game and being purely Egyptian. But then as time goes by, they become more and more Libyan. And actually, if you notice the figures on the right there, who is the chieftains, you can see that above the head is, it looks a bit like a cock's comb, it's actually a feather. It's actually the Libyan feather, which we saw back at the beginning on the sort of caricatured representation of Libyans in the tomb of Seti I. And so the very fact here, it's the local chieftain, Hornachti, who's actually got an Egyptian name but a Libyan title and is marked as a Libyan by his feather. He's making this donation, not the pharaoh, which had previously been the norm. So basically the royal power is eroding, and we're now getting multiple pharaohs in the north and the south. And as we'll see, they start springing up elsewhere in Egypt as well. And early 8th century, Egypt is fragmented, it has become fragmented in this way. And now what we've got is a southern kingdom, which is now no longer purely Theban. It's now been absorbed into an expanding Nubian kingdom, which has been gradually building up power over the previous decades. But also then we've got kingdoms in the middle of Egypt, as well as in the northeast, and then various principalities and chiefdoms elsewhere. So this kind of fragmentation of Egypt is now becoming quite a major thing. So we've actually got no fewer than 4 people who are all calling themselves pharaoh at this point in time, including this Nubian in the in the south, who's the Theban king has now been absorbed by an expanding Nubian kingdom. And much of that detail about who is where is derived from this stela, which was found at Jebel Barkal down in Sudan. It's now in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. The old museum is still there. And this is a text by a king whose name has been transcribed as Pianki and Pa. We're not quite sure which is the correct one of the two. He is a king, originally of Nubia, who has expanded into controlling Thebes as well. He's also got alliances with some of the various elements further north, including a king who's ruling around the Fayum area called Pefchal Awibas. But then a civil war kicks off in the north, whereby a number of the various local rulers in the north start ganging up on Pefchal Awibas, and as a result of that, Pa, or Pianki, marches north, and as related in this very, very long text, basically conquers the whole of Egypt right as far as the delta. And as part of that, he then takes the submission of these various local kings. There's Pianki on the left. He's been erased for some unknown reason. We've never quite worked it out. But in front of him, there is Nimlot, who is the king of Hermopolis, Ashmanaim, the area near Beni Hassan, that sort of area of Egypt. Then you've got Zorkon IV, who is the latest representative of the old line of Shoshenq I, Zorkon the Elder, and so on. Then you've also got Pefchal Awibas of the area around the Fayum, who we've already mentioned, and Nuput II, who's got a kingdom somewhere in the middle of the delta as well. These ones are actually represented because they are all claiming to be pharaohs. There's a whole long list of mayors, great chiefs, and various other hangers-on who also submit at this point. They all submit in person except for one, a man called Tefnachti, who had been the ruler of the northwestern delta and who seems to have been the ringleader in the ganging up on Pefchal Awibas. Now what's really interesting is that Pianki, having taken the submission of all these people, he doesn't then become king of the whole of Egypt. He actually leaves all of these people still in place. And right the way through until 664, when the story really sort of of the Libyan Pharaohs ends, we carry on having a number of these local pharaohs with the Nubian pharaoh as a broad overlord rather than actually being the sole king of Egypt. So this kind of split power has been argued to be part of Libyanness. It's something the Libyans very much. There's what anthropologists have called a segmented authority, whereby there's various firsts among equals rather than having a clear hierarchy. And that seems to be what the Nubians are perfectly happy to recognise even after the conquest of the north. Another feature of this particular period, and we're talking about the mid-8th century BC now, is a move towards archaism, a move towards an idea that they want to try and grasp the remote past, possibly reflecting the very poor conditions currently, that Egypt's falling apart, there's civil wars going on. They look back to a golden age of the Old and Middle Kingdoms, and therefore Zorkon IV, these relatively recently discovered representations of him, all are of Third Dynasty style. The actual representations, if you didn't have the cartouches, this would look like a Third Dynasty pharaoh. And also the cartouches are massively simplified. As during the 22nd Dynasty, royal names added more and more and more and more epithets to them. Son of beloved of Amun, then son of Isis, divine ruler, all these things. These all get stripped away, and in the middle of the 8th century, and they become a format far more akin to the Old and Middle Kingdoms. And also, it's probably during this period that this passageway is cut under the step pyramid to copy reliefs of this period. We often think of this sort of archaism being 26th dynasty. It looks like it's late 22nd now from the evidence of these blocks. Although the Nubians are happy to be overlords, they become rather more obvious overlords under Shabbataka, PA's successor. And Shabbataka's being successors do actually rule in Egypt, although with all these sub-kings recognised, except for the king of Sais, back in Renef, who is the successor of Tefnachti, the guy we'll be talking about, who seems to have been the main stormy petrel with relationships between the Libyan background rulers of northern Egypt and the Nubians. And according to Manetho, back in Renef, who is called Bacchorus in Greek, was apparently burned alive by Shabbataka. The others are all left in place, but clearly the ones who were not prepared to play ball and recognise the Nubians as their overlord were the Saites, and with a fiery result like that. Nubian control of Egypt, however, is ended by the Assyrians. Early in the very late 8th century, beginning of the 7th century, the Assyrians expand into Egypt. The Nubians run away, and after a number of bloodbaths, both caused by the Assyrians and also by the Nubians, only one local ruler is left standing, Psamtik I in the northwest delta. He is the heir of Baken Renef and Tefnachti, and he then reasserts a unitary state. And although he is a Libyan, of Libyan extraction, from here on in, Libyan titles disappear completely. He seems to completely end the idea of there being any kind of Libyan aspect to the regime. And here on in, he is very much very Egyptian, in spite of having a Libyan name. Now, let's just talk a little bit about how that story and how the material has been brought back together. Manetho, I've talked about, wrote a history of Egypt in the 3rd century BC, of which only fragments survive, is not particularly helpful in his listing of that period. When you start sort of saying 3 other kings, you name a couple and 3 others, and then 3 other more, it indicates probably the records he was dealing with indicate things were a bit flaky. And also there's this weird stuff talking about Azorco, who's probably Azorcon III, being called Hercules or Heracles. What's going on there? Don't know at all. There's some quite bizarre stuff going on as far as transmission is concerned. And therefore, this was what the early Egyptologists had to go with when they first sort of started trying to reconstruct Egyptian history from Egyptian sources in the early 19th century. This is Ippolito Rossellini on the left and Jean-François Champollion on the right. They led an expedition to Egypt in 1828-29, and they are amongst the first people who started trying to make sense of what they saw. And here at Karnak, it was Champollion who recognised this as potentially linking in with the Bible. These are the passages I mentioned earlier on, and therefore was able to identify Shishak and Shoshenq and start to tie some of this together. And further work was carried out by these other pioneer Egyptologists responsible for the early writing of history, Gardner Wilkinson and Richard Lepsius in Prussia. And so gradually, with the addition of the discovery of Passenhorst Stele in the 1850s, that during by the middle of the 19th century, at least a reasonable king list had been identified of these individuals. Their names were identified and roughly what order. There was some disagreement over order, but it wasn't too horrendous. But then people started realising that these names were not Egyptian. Because again, early on, we're still not quite clear of what's really an Egyptian name. But by the middle of the 1850s, there's something not right about these names. Shoshenq isn't somebody you find at any other period of Egyptian history. And there's this question, they start to sort of scratch their heads as to who are these people? And Nimlot sounds a bit like Nimrod, in the Old Testament. Azorkon, a bit like Sargon. So Samuel Birch and Heinrich Brugsch thought they might be Assyrians. A couple of other Egyptologists, Flinders Petrie and Peter Lepage Renouf, thought they might have come from Western Persia. And then, initially a minority, Mario de Rouget and Gaston Maspero, thought they might be Libyans. And that was the minority view for a long time, until a couple of linguists started looking at the names, looked at modern Libyan languages, Berber languages, and by the early 20th century, it was finally agreed these were probably Libyans. But there's quite a lot of debate going on there, and into the 1920s there are still a few outliers who still don't believe they're Libyans. As to their monuments, Tarnis is the principal place where they're finding stuff. Flinders Petrie, excavating there, is the first person to examine the gateway of Shoshenq III. I think you can see here from the picture that all the various back bits of that are clearly parts of the statue. You can see the ribbing of the kilt and things like that. Mm-hmm. So that's being found. Also, material was being found at Bubastis by Edward Naville. This is where the Jubilee gateway of Zorkon II was. And in 1927, the Orient Institute in Chicago found the tomb of Harziezi at Medinet Habu. I've got it outlined here. It's now deeply reburied. And then there's his coffin, part of the trough of which was usurped from a sister of Ramesses II. The lid, as you can see, at the time was very remarked upon as having a hawk's head. Very, very odd. And it was another decade on before it was realised that hawks' heads were very much a marker of the burial of these kings. And back at Tarnis, around the same time as Chicago was working at Medinet Habu, a French expedition was starting work at Tarnis, which carries on to the present day. And these are the key parts of the team, led by Pierre Montet of Strasbourg University on the right there. And here, just as the world was beginning the Second World War, they made the spectacular discovery of the royal tombs of Tarnis, which have never really received the sort of publicity they might deserve. Unfortunately, the world was distracted by rather more serious things than archaeology. But here they are coming down onto the royal tombs. The royal tombs are very different from those at Thebes. They're not like the Valley of the Kings with deep corridors leading into the rock. In the delta, you can't do that kind of thing because the water table is only a few feet below. So you build structures in shallow cuttings in the ground, then cover them over. And so these limestone structures are the royal tombs. And this is what Montet found. And here they are, with the one of them here belonging to Zorkon II, and here it's extensively decorated. It's very much decorated on a smaller scale version, in most cases, of the royal tombs of the New Kings and Valley of the Kings. So with lots of action. However, there is a difference. In addition to the various elements which are to do with the kings being resurrection through the passage of the sun god through the underworld, there are also chunks which are coming from the Book of the Dead, which previously had not really been a thing for kings. And most remarkably, we find Azorkon II having his heart weighed in front of Osiris, which no earlier king would dream of that happening to them. You do actually have scenes of the judgment hall in royal tombs, but the king is simply an onlooker. Here, he's actually the guy having his heart weighed. And that says something about a change in the standing of the monarchy during this kind of period. And also remember, Azorkon is this worried man about it all falling apart. So one seems to see a collapse in shall we say, the confidence of royalty during this period. The tombs had mostly been robbed, but we've still got the canopic jars here of Azorkon II and Teitlon I. We've also got Pamius, the successor of one of the successors of Shoshenq III there. His tomb, unfortunately, completely robbed out and only identifiable by a fragment of canopic jar. But Pasebkanu I, the king of the 21st dynasty, his tomb was intact. And at some point during the 22nd dynasty, he'd received a lodger in the form of Shoshenq, this mysterious king Shoshenq IIA. His coffin was found, along with the rest of the tomb, completely intact in 1939. And he again has this hawk-headed coffin. And we know from the debris from some of the other tombs, other kings of the period also have that. And unfortunately, though, although found intact, the damp conditions meant that his burial was by no means well preserved. And here we can just see how everything has just rotted and collapsed inside the coffin. And we can just sort of see his skull just peeking out here. But all of that debris was actually this beautiful gilded cartonnage case, which was reconstructed in the Cairo Museum from the various collapsed debris. There's also the gold mask, and there's a number of beautiful bits of jewellery also found there. Interestingly enough, we'd already talked about Haziezi having had a head injury. He had as well, but in this case, he'd had an injury somewhere on his forehead, which had got infected and eaten through to his brain. So he died fairly horribly. It's one of the few cases where we can actually be sure exactly what a king died of. And poor Shoshenq IIA had basically meningitis caused by an infected wound on his head. Well, we'd love to know how he got that, but... And then we've also got the tomb of Shoshenq III there. Unfortunately, that had been robbed, but two sarcophagi in it, one of Shoshenq III and his immediate successor, Shoshenq IV, there as well. Work carries on at Tanis, and the work at the Sacred Lake revealed these blocks only a few years ago, which change our ideas about late Libyan period art as well. There's been, as I say, the research on the Libyan period has extended since the beginning of Egyptology, but has only really become something where people have been specialising in detail really in the last 50 years or so. And this book by late Ken Kitchen, who sadly died only a few weeks ago, was really the first attempt to put it all together in a sensible way. Ken was right about some things, probably wrong about others, but it's really a foundation text. And also then a few years ago, the late Rob Rittner, again died only a couple of years ago, produced a digest of all the translations of the inscriptions of the period, which are absolutely fundamental. Also, there has been a rather more left field approach to it. Those have all been based around conventional chronology. In the early 90s, and still going on, there are a number of of individuals who are arguing for a massive reduction in the level and in the dates of this kind of period. So there's a lot of debate going on both within conventional Egyptology and also with a slightly more extended form of Egyptology. Now these aren't the sort of cranks of the Graham Hancock type, but they're coming from a left field, and some of the things they've got some decent ideas and some not so. But it's just, we always want to emphasise that this period is one of the few which still hasn't really settled down. We've got a basic shape, but actually most of the detail differs between individual Egyptologists. The material from the tombs at Thebes is becoming slightly more familiar. The touring exhibition, nominally about Ramesses II, included a lot of material, including this coffin, which was shown in San Francisco, I think at least one other place in the States. But again, but still, they don't really have the drawing power that so many other pharaohs do, but perhaps they should do. This is the lecture tonight has been very much cut down version of this book, which is currently in final proof stage and should inshallah be out in November, which will say give much more of the chapter and verse of the kind of stuff I've been talking about tonight. So thank you very much indeed for your attention, and of course happy to take any questions from the floor.
So now that that's all been cleared up, I'm sure no one has any questions, but we do have some time. Chris, go ahead.
Yes, sir.
So you showed us a lot of texts. Did the Libyan kings and the Egyptians share the same language, or was there any influence from the Libyan kings that changed language? Was this all hieroglyphs?
Very good question. Everything we have from this period is pure Egyptian. You have no indication, apart from the fact that the names are a bit weird, as to anything which is sort of derived from the Libyan side of things. We're not even sure whether the Libyans had any kind of script at this period. They say nothing has been found, and all their official stuff, and also for project, it's all just straightforward Egyptian. So that's one of the many things about the dynamics of all this, is how much of purely Egyptian, how much are they simply buying into Egyptian, and how much are they trying to bring a Libyan tang to it. There's certainly nothing linguistic about which does that, but that's one of the many areas of debate of how Libyan are the Libyans. Are they simply people of foreign extraction who are now sort of largely, apart from their names, Egyptianized, or are they actually still doing stuff which is Libyan? And so the way that everything starts to fragment, and the use of all these Libyan chieftain titles suggests there's something to do with that. But how deep is that? Because some of these people, when we look at the names as well, there are families, half of them have got Egyptian names, half have got Libyan names, and there's no indication of why that is. You know, somebody with a perfect Egyptian name will have a couple of sons with a Libyan name and a couple of Egyptian ones. So that's one of the big areas of debate amongst scholars around all this. Yes, there and then.
Can you talk a little bit about the role of religion? Did the Libyan kings adopt Egyptian gods and goddesses?
Yeah.
Did they bring their own?
Yeah. Another interesting point, there is no evidence of anything Libyan in religion at all. Everything about it, textually and so on, is all pure Egyptian. There are no Libyan gods apparently being brought into any of this. And this is why it's sort of, where you've got this, there are certain hints at there being social things going on about these chieftains or whatever, but all the foreground stuff, the language, the religion, the constitution, the nominal, the use of royal names, is all absolutely bog standard. And that's why we have such this debate as to where the Libyan line actually is in all of this.
And the role of priests, was it?
No, all the priesthoods are bog standard. There's nothing strict. Although you may have the various priests of Amun having Libyan names, they hold all the old normal priestly titles. There's no new priestly titles. There's no new gods. Hence the reason why this is it's slightly confusing what's going on. But again, the Nubians don't bring in new gods particularly. But say the Libyans, there's no sign of anything to do with any linguistic or religious at all. Yes.
I think in the beginning you showed a map that had like a quote Libyan homeland, like where
Yeah.
it came from. During this period, was there like still a foreign population of Libyans existing there, or was it?
We assume so, but again we've got no evidence.
Yeah.
All the evidence we've got about the Libyans, the very nature of the Libyans, all comes from the Egyptian end. And for most of Egyptian history, it's saying how awful they are, the vile Libyans, etc., etc., etc. Then suddenly you start getting these Libyan names appearing. Then you start getting Libyan titles of these various local dignitaries, who may be at one point, they may be great chief of the Meshwesh, and also hold a perfectly good normal Egyptian title, but they sort of appear in, sort of come in there. So we're assuming there is, people are back home in Libya, but whether there's any kind of, one is sort of assuming that once you've got probably Egyptianized Libyans as kings, there's probably a certain degree of immigration from the Libyan heartland. And that's one explanation which has been given, to the way that Libyan titles became much more common later on in the period, because you've got people who are coming in. But that's again, all we're just inferring that. Because the archaeology that's been carried out in Libya hasn't really revealed very much at all. Excuse me, sorry. Yes, sir.
What do you think it was that sort of allowed Egypt to come back in a more indigenous way, I guess, in the same period after this period?
I think it's probably the Assyrian invasion. I think what's helped there is that during the chapter on this is quite long in the book about what goes on here. And effectively, between them, the Assyrians and the Nubians managed to kill all of the various existing local chieftains, apart from Santik. So I think at the end, he can say, right, everybody else is dead, I'm the only one left standing, I'm now going to remake the state as I want to do it, and I want to make it back as it was, centuries previous. So I think he's lucky that, because the problem was, apart from the Saites, who were consistent in being anti-Nubian, the others all flip-flop between the Nubians and the Assyrians, depending on who seemed to be winning. Eventually, the Assyrians got fed up with this and killed them all. And then, when the Nubians came back, briefly before the Assyrians came back again, they killed the ones who had stayed. So Santik is the one left standing, and hence I think he's taking the view, right, I'm just going to draw a line on this, and by the I think it takes a bit of time, and there may be a few people who haven't been killed by the Assyrians or the Nubians to mop up. But he's quite clearly and by year 10, he's taken over Thebes as well, and for the rest of the 26th dynasty, we seem to have a unitary state once again. So I think it's just the fact that the tail end was so bloody that there was one person left standing was then able to reassert the idea of the pharaonic state. Yes.
At the very beginning, you mentioned Herihor. How does his legacy or impact, do his ideas, do you think, fuel this rebellion or the civil war in the south, or what do you think that there's anything?
I think Herihor, again, as far as we can work it out, the early 21st dynasty, there is a sort of a friendly cooperation between north and south, and then actually after Herihor's death, the country is then formally come back together again. Although there is a largely independent high priest, they're all the same family. So the Hairy Hall bit, I think, is way back in the past. I think probably what's happening is something happens under whatever's happening under Take-Lot the First is where the rot starts to set in. But again, we can't tell what that rot is. But it's in contrast with the regular use of royal names along with regular years and everything under the first two kings, and then Take-Lot. So I think that the rot has started in there, but we can't quite get a feel for what it is. Yeah, there's another question. Yeah.
This may be more a general question about Egyptology that likely there's a clear answer to, but over the past centuries, as we've discovered evidence of new pharaohs who could potentially enter like a canonical understanding of Egypt, is there a general, I don't know how to word this best, like threshold of evidence that is agreed upon before like it is widely accepted, or like certain types of evidence that is generally looked for?
Not necessarily. I think it's more just it depends on the nature of it. One of them who was a sort of a late edition was Shoshenq IV, and that was because we realised that the style of royal names change with Zorkon with the Zorkon II, and Shoshenq IV was originally thought to be a variant spelling of Shoshenq I's name. However, once we realised that that format of name doesn't happen until Zorkon II and later, it couldn't be, so it has to be somewhere else, and the only place he could fit was between Shoshenq III and Pime. Because the number of people who actually do this period is relatively small, so we normally can agree this kind of stuff fairly rapidly between ourselves. But on the other hand, there are still there are differences of opinion. And there are differences of opinion. And so therefore, my book very much has my sort of take on it. But I hope I actually sort of bring out where other people have got slightly different views. Some quite radically different, some just sort of subtly different.
Could you give an example of an idea that maybe is more radically different in yours than?
Well, the most radical, of course, is this question about chronology, whereby you effectively collapse the whole thing by 100 years, which has various knock-on effects. I suppose the main thing is to do with whether or not there are these Shoshenq 2, 3, 2a, B, and C are real or not. And if they are, whether they are embedded in the reign of Take-Lot the First, or should be actually added into the overall chronology. And that's the big issue. Is this person somebody who is in parallel with somebody, and therefore, although all very interesting, doesn't impact the overall history or not? Because what happened a few years ago, about 30 odd years ago now, it's frightening when you think was that Take-Lot II, who we now think is an independent king of Thebes, used to be thought to be part of the overall line of the Tanite kings. And when he was taken out of that and moved over to Thebes, then what did we do with the then we had to do some major recalculation of reign lengths and so on around that. I think everybody's reasonably happy with that now, although Ken Kitchen wasn't. I think it was because he'd sort of come up with what had been sort of the accepted picture. And then everybody started chipping away at that, including some of his former students, including me. And he sort of looked upon us with a certain amount of pity, I suppose. We'd gone to the dark side, having been sort of brought, which is inevitable, though, with generations of academia, that you're brought up by your professor as this is how it's all done. And then you start looking into it again, because again, he left in his book, the Third Intermediate Period there, he left a few loose ends. And his various students started trying to fill in those loose ends. Unfortunately, when you started pulling at these loose ends, the whole thing started to come unraveled. And therefore, by the time although that book is really useful as a quarry, because he gives reference to almost all the evidence, his actual reconstruction now is effectively obsolete. And so last time I think he gave a public lecture, he was sort of rather railing against a sort of, that he was still right, but the rest of the world was wrong.
That's wrong.
But yeah.
That has to be our last question. I want for up here, those of you who wish to continue the conversation, because I can just hear from the lack of breathing in the room how fascinated you all are by this really tumultuous and confusing period, and it's a long period, isn't it? I mean,
we're talking. Well, if we're talking about Zorkon the Elder is around about 1000 BC, and Samtik is 663.
So, almost 350 years of this quote-unquote chaos, for lack of a better word.
But the thing is that it's also been, probably until Ken wrote his book, it's been very much neglected. That many of the standard books written up to there normally gave half a page to this whole period, if you were lucky.
Yeah.
And or just in one sentence, it's all too horrible. I'm now going to jump forward. You get to Ramesses the 11th. It then becomes all too horrible, and now with Samtik the First, it all gets back to normal. There's quite a bit of that kind of thing. So,
well, the conversation.
I'm hoping this book will sort of bring the period forward to more people. It's got colour pictures and things, and also various diagrams, which hopefully make the rather complicated overlaps. There's that simplified version I can include in there. Also allow it to become a bit more accessible to people.
The conversation will continue downstairs. The bar and the dining room await you. Thank you so much, Aidan.